Anticipation in the air, expectations running high, and election with far-reaching implications, not just for America, but for the rest of the world as well. It's election day in the United States of America, all 50 states going to the polls. Voters writing the final chapter of this historic presidential election. A record number of early voters, as we've been telling you, is a crucial sign in itself. More than 100 million Americans have cast their ballot even before the day, the final election day. Let's get you the latest from the battleground states. With us is Sarah Walton, joining us from the biggest battleground state in the U.S., Florida. Sarah, what does it look like? Florida is the state, they say, that will decide who will go to the White House next.
Yes, you're right. There's a very big chance of that because of the large number of electoral votes that Florida, a swing state, holds 29 of those electoral votes. And actually what we're seeing on the ground here in Tallahassee, where I am today, is a sort of steady stream of voters turning up, but none of the long queues actually that were predicted or that were seen during early voting. There's a sort of just people coming in ones and twos through the morning. I think there's a good chance that is because of the sheer numbers of people who have already voted. You mentioned 100 million Americans across the country, but even here in Florida, there's about 9 million Floridians, which is 63% of registered voters in Florida, who have already used either an early voting day or have sent a mail-in ballot. And what's interesting about the results there is that while Democrats are, seen to normally be more likely to vote early, and they did indeed have an early lead in that early voting tally, Republicans have been slowly catching up, and it's now a very narrow margin between the number of vote casts between registered Democrats and registered Republicans. And so that means turnout today on the final election day could be very important. If there is a large turnout of registered Republican voters, which is what some pollsters have predicted, it could be a sign that this state is leaning towards re-electing President Trump. But a big caveat here, we should mention that just because we know who a voter has registered their affiliation for in the past, doesn't mean they will necessarily cast their vote for that party here today. It's very hard to get a clear steer on what we can read out of those early voting figures. So really, it is all still to play for here in Florida.
And Florida's Hispanic vote is going to be crucial in deciding which way the state goes. What are the early signals, if any, that you're picking up from the voters?
You're right. Florida is a state with a large number of Latino voters, and it's quite hard to really call it one large voting bloc. It's a very diverse community of people from many different countries, some who have been in America for generations, others who are more newly arrived. And Donald Trump particularly has been focusing on the Cuban-American community, many of whom live in the Miami area. Now, people who have arrived from Cuba here potentially have a far more negative view of the socialist regime that they have left behind. Donald Trump has gone to great lengths in his rallies in recent months to say that Joe Biden, his Democrat opponent, is a socialist, and that he would as president, turn America into a socialist country. So Donald Trump is very much hoping that rhetoric is appealing to Cuban-American voters, particularly in the Miami area.
Donald Trump has said that he will do better this time than last time, and he's predicted 306 of the Electoral College votes for himself. Technically speaking, Joe Biden can win without having Florida on board, even though Florida has gone with a person who has made it to the White House since 1996. But for Donald Trump, wouldn't you say this is a do-or-die state?
Yes, there is a very, very big chance of that. The number of votes, electoral college votes available for Florida means that without winning Florida, the path to get the magic 270 electoral votes that Donald Trump would need for another 4 years in the White House, that path becomes much narrower. We are likely to have quite an early result here in Florida because they count their postal ballots pretty quickly. If the state votes Democrats, as Joe Biden said at a rally a couple of days ago, it's game over. There's very few paths left for Donald Trump. If Donald Trump does win Florida, we then have to look to some of the other swing states many of whom are actually going to be counting their mail-in ballots much later. So it could potentially drag out the election process until we find out who is the winner.
Right. Sarah Walton, thanks very much for bringing us that update from a polling station in Florida, a very important state in this election. Also joining us now on WION is Professor Nicholas Grossman, who is editor-at-large at ARC Digital. He's also a professor of international relations at the University of Illinois. Professor Grossman, welcome to WION. Who are you putting your money on?
So, I mean, the answer is really, I don't know, but the numbers indicate that Joe Biden is more likely to win. And so if I had to make a guess, that's what I would say. And part of the reason why this is a harder election to predict is because first, with the pandemic might be throwing off some polling models, and also because a lot of people expect that the Trump campaign in particular will challenge the results if they do not win. So President Trump has been telegraphing a intention to try to challenge many mail-in ballots, to send in lawyers to try to get some ballots thrown out afterwards, and to reject results that at least preliminary results that do not show him winning. And because of that, I think a lot of people are more cautious, so that the polling models show a Biden lead, but there's also some possibility that the election won't be normal in the way that past American elections were. So that makes it a little harder to predict. But I guess if I had to guess, I'd say that I'll go with the numbers and that Biden ends up winning in the end.
Let's look at what Trump has just said. And one reporter has quoted him as saying that he's offering a mildly confident view of his prospects. I'm quoting from the U.S. president. There's no reason to play games. I look at it as being a very, very solid chance of winning here. I don't know how they rate the chances. I think a lot of that has to do with the tremendous crowd size. A lot of Republicans we've spoken to have been dwelling on how many people turn out to cheer for Donald Trump vis-a-vis Joe Biden's rallies, which were relatively a muted affair. Where do you think Trump's confidence stems from?
Well, partially there is an incentive for candidates to tell people that they're winning. After all, everybody wants to be a part of a winning campaign, not a losing campaign. So that helps motivate voters and helps motivate volunteers. And also there's something kind of deep in human psychology that has difficulty telling the difference between big numbers and really big numbers. So something like 150 million people or so will vote. Over 90 million people have voted already, and maybe say something like 10,000 or 15,000 attend a large rally. So it does signal a degree of enthusiasm. It also signals a greater degree to accept COVID risks, to go out to a large gathering where many people aren't wearing masks. And given that Donald Trump has been telling people that COVID is not very risky, and Joe Biden has been telling people that it is risky, it makes sense that Trump is holding large rallies and that his supporters are going to them, and Biden is not. But overall, it's a common mistake to think of these large rallies, which do so show some enthusiasm, as proof of how voters are going to go. And a similar example was Bernie Sanders continually got more attendees at his rallies, both this time and in 2016 in the Democratic primary, and he did not win. So it just means more whether you want to hold rallies and whether you have the sort of people who support you who want to attend. So that part I don't think matters all that much. But I would expect both candidates to at least sound confident notes going into the election. And I don't think you can treat any of those pronouncements for also their campaign members or politicians that are their surrogates on television. I don't think you can treat those as anything more than cheering on their team.
What do you make of the very large number of people who've already voted? I know that the Wuhan virus and the pandemic remains a concern, but this is 47% of registered voters nationwide who voted. Is this a political statement in itself?
It's an amazing amount of people who voted early. And a lot of it has to do with the pandemic, but part of it also has to do with questions surrounding efforts to potentially manipulate the election. So there have been concerns in the United States, for example, about vote by mail, and the mail was being slowed down after Trump had installed somebody new at the U.S. Postal Service. And the Attorney General had recently announced that the law does not require delivering the mail by any particular date, as Trump campaign officials are trying to challenge rules that say in various states that mail that is postmarked, that is sent by election day should still count, as opposed to it has to be received, which could be disrupted by mail delays. So one of the signs of so much early voting, I think, is fear that especially fear among Democrats, that if they did not get their votes done and made sure that they were in advance, that there could be some sort of difficulties with the countings afterwards. Also, though, the Trump campaign had been encouraging people to vote on Election Day, whereas the Biden campaign had been encouraging people to vote early. So there's a good chance that more of those early votes were Democrats and more of the votes on Election Day will be Republicans. But we'll have to see how the total looks like in the end before we'll know.
Right. Professor Grossman, I'm going to request you to stay with us. I want to take our viewers straight to California. Rachel Silverman is joining us from California. Rachel, how is the voting situation looking like, and what kind of reactions do you see from the people who've turned up to cast their ballot?
Well, there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty here. It's finally election day, but the polls were wrong in 2016, and so Biden supporters are worried. They feel like this is the most important election of their lifetime, and Trump supporters are worried as well. It's really an interesting sort of divergence here in the United States. People who look at Donald Trump as a liar, and people who look at him as a man who can say no wrong. There's a record amount of mail-in and early votes. People are lining up to vote in the polls today, even though we already have a record number of votes. So far, no shenanigans. Things have so far been going smoothly, but people do have a sense of anxiety as the president has signaled that no matter who wins, there will be some uncertainty and chaos after the election. With legal challenges, resistance to normal transition, all that may cloud the prospects of an orderly post-election period, no matter who wins the election.
Professor Grossman, through the day today, we've seen images of shop owners and business owners in New York and elsewhere boarding up. There is a fear, we are told, of civil unrest in the event of the election result not throwing up a clear winner. How serious is this concern, according to you? And is this one of the worst elections in that respect that America has seen?
I think it's quite serious, and there at least has not been anything like this in my lifetime. You might have to go back to the 1960s, and even then, perhaps not as much violence or unrest directly related to the election. Over the summer in the United States, there were a lot of very large demonstrations against excessive police force that was set off by police killing a man named George Floyd. That was captured on video, and it was a pretty gratuitous, meaning a non-threatening person, and a pretty gratuitous killing. And this set off a lot of large protests calling for police reform and more efforts to fight systemic racism. And it also triggered some riots and some storefronts, store windows getting bashed in. And some of these groups were people who were associated with the protesters, some who were what you can just call troublemakers of various sorts, who are mostly looking to break things or looking to get into a fight with police. And so I think on one end, there's an expectation that either if Trump wins or if it looks like Trump loses and is trying to retain power, that a lot of these groups will go to places, especially Washington, but also, say, major cities like New York or Chicago, and to see unrest. On the other hand, there's also a possibility of violence that if Biden wins, or if there's an ambiguous outcome from Trump supporters who have in some ways been demonstrating a show of force, such as a convoy, a large group of trucks of Trump supporters just yesterday surrounded a Biden campaign bus on the highway, and we're driving around them. That there have been incidents of shootings in cities of where people often connected to not the Trump campaign, but groups of Trump supporters have taken it upon themselves to try to respond to some of those protesters with violence, that there have been a couple of shootings, for example. And so a lot of people are on edge. The easy way out of that, kind of fingers crossed, is that the electoral outcome will be relatively clear relatively quickly. But if it is not, then a lot of people are, and I think reasonably, unfortunately, bracing for some violence.
Right. I think some of that nervousness is also spilling onto the markets. Let's take a look at how Wall Street is performing on election day. Major indices registered gains in the opening hours of trade. The Dow Jones rose more than 200 points. It's trading 2.3% higher last we checked. NASDAQ is having a good day. We are told it's currently trading more than 2% higher. Investors putting their money on a Biden victory. And they're also expecting the Democrats to retake the Senate and retain the House of Representatives. Wall Street normally prefers Republican policies, but this election is being held in the shadow of a massive economic slowdown. Stimulus is the need of the hour. Wall Street feels Joe Biden and the Democrats are better placed to introduce a bailout plan for Americans. Professor Grossman, do you agree with Wall Street's assessment of who can do a better job of rescuing this economy? Because I'm not sure what Biden's plan is. Do go ahead.
So with the important caveat that one day of stock market moves doesn't really mean anything. There's all sorts of reasons why it could be. I think part of the optimism about the economy associated with the Biden campaign is that Congress has been trying to negotiate a large COVID relief package, and the Democrats have been trying to do a much bigger version than Republicans would be willing to do, and the current Republican Senate has been blocking it. So one expectation is that if Democrats win, both Joe Biden winning the White House and also Democrats winning the Senate, that they will pass some sort of big stimulus package, which will bring a lot of money into the economy. There's also the possibility that there are heightened expectations of a Biden White House being able to manage the pandemic better. So as much as there are economic problems in the country, the main source of those economic problems is the virus. It is not coming from government efforts to fight the virus. And the Trump the Trump White House has done very little to actually try to control the spread of COVID-19 or to create conditions that could help people reopen their economy safely. So with things like, say, encouraging mask use that doctors all around the world recommend to reduce the spread because, the virus is spread by droplets spread through the air, whereas Trump and his team and some friendly media have been denigrating mask use and kind of mocking people who do it. So there perhaps is a dual expectation, both that the Democrats will do larger stimulus than Republicans would do, and also that the Democrats, if they take power, will put a lot more effort into tackling the pandemic problem, which will then allow greater economic activity to take place.
Right. We'll take our viewers to Washington, D.C. now. The White House will have a new president by tomorrow this time, hopefully, if things do not go to court. Voice of America's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara is joining us from Washington, D.C. Patsy, over to you.
Any longer after this, blitz over the weekend of 10 campaign stops in so many states over the weekend. He will be at the White House watching the election returns, while Joe Biden will be in Wilmington, Delaware, to watch the returns of the election with his running mate Kamala Harris. Right. So this is something that perhaps your viewers need to know, is that the elections in the U.S. is not based on popular vote, but it's based on what's called electoral college votes. What this means is that each state is allocated a certain number of votes based on their population, but the majority of states have a winner-takes-all system. This is 48 out of 50 states, and only 2 have a proportional system. Which means what? Which means that there's a handful of states which are called the swing states, which could go either Republican or Democrat. And the vast majority always goes for one party or another. And the states to watch for tonight is Pennsylvania and Florida, as well as about 4 other states, including Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida. So the key tonight is Florida, because the way the states have different laws. The U.S. is also a federation of states where it's not one election day for the entire country, but think of it as 50 different elections, because each state has different regulations. And Florida is one of those states that can count their votes early. So we may know the results of Florida tonight, but not so the case of Pennsylvania. We may have to wait for tomorrow, even a couple of days. But those two states are really crucial for a Trump victory, a path to 270 electoral votes that he needs out of 538 to be able to keep the White House. Yeah, so this is something that both sides are quite concerned about. Post-election litigation is definite, because right now there's already hundreds of lawsuits around the country, talking about how ballots should be distributed, how ballots should be counted. These are all already going on. Now, the concern about post-election friction and violence is certainly a big concern, particularly because the president, as we know a couple of weeks ago, has refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power and has several times signaled to his supporters that unless he is declared the winner, the election is rigged, and not accept the results of the election. So these are, of course, concerning to everybody. As far as I've heard from election officials, local election officials, as well as local law enforcement, they're really bracing up and trying to make sure that everybody can vote safely and that the votes can be counted safely.